The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Before we hit the record button, you're talking about some of the commodities you really like. And I know this is kind of your area of expertise, where you're great in macro, you understand it just as well as probably anybody out there. But where you really take deep dives are with these companies in the commodity space. So we discussed gold the other day. People can go to my other channel and check that out. But you've also done these deep dives on other producers in the uranium space. And I don't know if you've gotten to nat gas or coal as well, but can you expand on that?
Okay. So in China, there's really bad stagflation right now, even though unemployment's also rising. And a lot of it's because of bad central planning. The People's Bank of China, their central bank, is printing enormously to try to prevent real estate, to bail out their state-owned enterprise banks. And that's why you haven't seen banks fail. But there are legitimate electricity shortages and legitimate energy crisis, especially for cheaper electricity. And there's lots of videos that your listeners can go see on YouTube now. One of the best YouTube channels is China Insights. There's been quite a few videos out in the last couple of weeks interviewing business owners in China, factory owners, talking about their energy costs are up 10x or more. And so China has had, and it's not just China that has electricity and energy shortages, it's also the European Union, it's also the United Kingdom. So the natural gas price rising a lot, and there was a ton of natural gas supply that came offline here in the US. The US was one of the major exporters of natural gas because of all that shale gas, but so much supply came offline that you knew that the price was going to have to go up. Now, the natural gas price was one of the top performing commodities in 2021, the US natural gas price. The foreign natural gas prices are up even more than that. In the last, I would say 2 months, the natural gas price in the US has come down a little bit, but over the long term, so over the next 3 to 5 years, natural gas, I think, is in a bull market because demand is steadily growing. The major demand component, and this is more stable than oil demand, is for cheaper electricity. So there's only two forms of electricity now, George, that can handle baseload power electricity generation, and it's not wind and solar. So wind and solar is where all this ESG investment, and wind and solar are not really that clean because solar panels, a lot of them don't last very long, and they're made with a lot of dirty, especially rare earth elements. The large wind turbines, the motors, and a lot of parts in the large wind turbines, and then also solar panels. A lot of them are made with rare earth elements, and those things are extremely toxic. Right. With the air, soil, and water to mine, they're an enormous pain in the ass to separate on the value chain. So governments are allocating, because the energy markets are heavily politicized, but the two best forms for electricity power generation, the most stable for baseload, are nuclear power and natural gas. So natural gas is cleaner burning. So I think that politicians, they kind of realize that if they're going to force people to buy more electric vehicles with tax credits, that they can't shut down so they can go after coal, and they're starting to threaten to go after oil more. They're blocking drilling leases. If the oil price continues to go up, then Congress will bring the oil executives in front. They could threaten windfall profits taxes. They could dump, that is just temporary with the manipulation to dump the strategic petroleum reserves. But I don't think they can do that on natural gas. There's no strategic natural gas reserves either. Right. Because countries don't keep natural gas storage tanks. So natural gas, I think, is in a long-term bull market. In the short term, natural gas could still correct. For the uranium market, there's now 3 physical uranium ETFs. The major one is Sprott Inc. I've recommended this publicly. So Sprott Inc., they don't mine, but they invest in a lot of commodities producers. And then they also own all these really interesting commodities trusts. So they own physical gold trust, physical silver trust, a mix of gold and silver, a platinum trust, a palladium trust. That's a mixed one too. And then they just started early in 2021, a physical uranium trust. So instead of buying these trusts directly, where you're not going to get paid a dividend, and this company has done very well, you could just buy shares on the dip if you want a dividend stock of Sprott Inc., and you're going to get a diversified basket then of commodities exposure with these different trusts. Right. But uranium has a bright future because you have these trusts now stockpiling uranium, and there has not been a lot of new uranium supply brought online. And it's going to be really tough in the developed world for a lot of these uranium miners to get permits to mine, because obviously uranium is radioactive. There's a lot of problems with uranium mining, with the water, with treating it. So it's really a pain in the ass for the rules regulators and politicians, bureaucrats, and regulators. And a lot of them are anti-nuclear anyway, because they're on this ESG agenda with solar and wind and advanced biofuels and some of these other green tech. So I think we're going to see a bull market, a big bull market here in uranium, but it's not going to go straight up, especially if the stock market crashes and asset prices crash. But what's going on in China, George, is really important. We should probably talk about this before we close, because of all the craziness going on with the Chinese real estate prices and the Chinese real estate developers. The People's Bank of China is printing money like crazy to try to prevent their real estate prices from crashing, and they're still crashing. So you've had a change, a paradigm shift, I would say, the last like 3 or 4 months in real estate markets in many different Chinese cities. The banks have not failed yet, but commodities demand for food, energy, and also for physical demand in China for gold, silver, and platinum, it's absolutely exploded.
So, I mean, I'm trying to kind of think through what that means for global macro if China goes into a recession as a result of their real estate market tanking. And, I think that it sets a bid for the dollar. How do you think that the situation in China that people have kind of swept under the rug and they're not really paying attention to anymore, how do you think that plays out with the global economy?
So China is a mess of central planning right now, a mess, many trillions, tens of trillions in misallocated capital.
Yeah.
I was just watching a video on China Insight over the weekend, and there's Chinese companies. First of all, the Chinese government over the summer, they banned private sector education companies. Yeah, so that was a large industry, and the Chinese government just decided we don't want it anymore. So all these employees, tens of millions of employees, are going to be out of their jobs. If they haven't already been fired, they're going to be fired in the next 6 months. And yet the Chinese government is still printing to try to bail out the banks for bad real estate loans and to prop up real estate prices. So you still have, even though you have unemployment, wide-scale unemployment now in a lot of major Chinese industries. So Chinese technology companies, the large ones, are firing. They either have already fired 30% of their workforce, or they're going to in the next 6 months. They've announced fire 30% of their workforce, but the government is not allowing deflation, at least not allowing like normal deflation. So you're seeing, and then the Chinese government has issued official warnings about stagflation and then told people to stockpile food and energy.
How is the Chinese government printing exactly? Like, what's the process there? Are they just deficit spending more?
I think it's very similar to what the Fed did with the large US banks in 2007, 8, and 9. So they see that the real estate crisis could get worse. I think there's a couple major differences here between the real estate crisis in the US, the real estate bust in 2007 and 2009, right, and the one in China. So the one in the US, okay, let me do China first. First, China has at least 65 million, and that number is probably low, empty homes. So these are either unfinished homes, partially unfinished, or unfinished homes. And these things are in disrepair. So these basically, a lot of these homes could be knocked down. So these were homes that were built. The developer probably unloaded them to someone else, or they're sitting on the developer's balance sheet. Or there's tons of pre-sale scams where they've collected either a large down payment from people, or the people have paid in full and the developer did not even finish part of the house. Yeah. Right. So the real estate developer, if they declare bankruptcy in China, the person who put down the down payment or paid in full is going to get fully screwed, because the bankruptcy laws in China are not as good as the ones here in the US. But In China, you have the shadow banking system, but that's different. It is large, but it's different than the amount of derivatives that were tied to the housing bubble with credit default swaps on the banks and other derivatives in 2007, 2008, 2009. So it's similar, but there are also differences. So there's a lot more empty homes in China. There's a lot more wide scale home ownership in China. But now you're starting to see that people, very similar to the US, are upside down in their mortgages. So even if they walked away from, if they tried to walk away, they would still owe, if they sold their house or tried to walk away from it, they would still owe more money than the house is worth on their mortgage.
Right.
But there's not the derivatives that were tied to that, unless there's there could be some derivatives in the Chinese shadow banking system, but it's so opaque, no one would know. But right now the Chinese government is printing, and this is why you have not seen any headlines yet that this is why you have not seen any headlines yet that any of the major Chinese banks have failed, because they're probably monetizing that bad debt. They're probably taking it off the books. What they did also was they lowered the reserve requirement for the banks. Normally what people say when the bank's reserve ratio requirements are lowered, they say that that's bullish, that the banks could lend more, but actually in times of trouble, when they do that, it's to make the banks look more solvent than they really are. So if you lower the reserve ratio requirements more, and the Fed did this, they took it down to zero, basically, in 2008.
Yep.
This is how insolvent the banks were. So there were banks, a lot of the banks, because of how insolvent they were before the Fed started buying up all this toxic stuff in 2008, the banks were leveraged 60 to 120 to 1. That's how leveraged they were before the Fed started taking. So there were actually a lot of banks that were even more leveraged at one point because of how bad the real estate prices crashed than Bear Stearns and Lehman.
Yeah, right.
So all the bank, like Citibank and all the others, were massively over leveraged. So when the reserve, things are bad. So they're saying that like, oh, we're going to allow the banks to inject more credit. That's not why they're doing it. So that was like the false narrative that was put out in China. It was to make the banks look more solvent while they try to fix the bank balance sheets with the bad loans.
Yeah, because they're the ones that are holding the bag on all these ghost cities that were just complete, total malinvestment.
But they're allowing the real estate developers to fail, though, or at least default on foreign bonds. So the dollar denominated debt, they're allowing the banks to fail on that. They're screwing over foreign bondholders. The bankruptcy laws, especially for foreigners in China, are not good.
Yeah.
And yet you see a lot of Westerners still invest in China, especially like the BlackRocks. Well, that's probably a lot of it's political or bribes.